When talking about RPGs, I have heard this comment several times. Side quests are boring, and I end up skipping them. If the subquest asks me to gather stuff, it is boring. Going from point A and B several times is a terrible way to kill the mood. More often than not, side quests are seen in a negative way, so here I want to talk about different moments where side quests were definitely entertaining, and others where it felt like a forced task. It is worth mentioning that this topic is filled with nuances, because sometimes all you want to do is shut your brain off and do something simple, while other times you want to have an engaging playing session. So let me ask you, is there a side quest that definitely made you quit a game? Or the other way around, a side quest that felt like it should have been part of the main journey? Without further ado, let's begin. The first thing that came to my mind was, do side quests have to be entertaining? Like, is there an unwritten rule explaining the ins and outs of side content? Or were they simply thrown around as an excuse to extend the gameplay? When I started thinking in this topic, I made a little challenge to myself. You have 10 minutes to write down good and bad quests, without looking at your list of games, and the idea was to be completely impartial. If I remembered it, it appears here. And the second thing to pop up in my mind was the games that oftentimes log the ending with side content. Endings are topics for another video, but the main idea was that games like Shin Megami Tensei 4, Etrian Odyssey, Labyrinth of Galeria throw you away if you haven't done particular things. Perhaps the Etrian Odyssey is the one that could be left aside unless you also want to consider the post-content as part of the journey. The deal is that I wouldn't be surprised if plenty of people ended up leaving these games aside, because they had a combination of classic fetch this or that item. And that is probably where I will go a bit harsher with Labyrinth of Refrain or Galeria, because there are literally points in the story where you need to farm materials in the dungeon, having to go back and forth several times. So to me, that would be something to avoid. The moment you force the player to do something, part of the enjoyment goes away. Mixing these two things is a bad idea. Regarding world building, I believe there are many ways to engage the player into side content. Some of the subquests that came to my mind are the ones presented in Bloodborne. Strictly speaking, it is not presented as a subquest, but you can ask people around to go to Cathedral Ward, and there are interesting things that may happen. For example, while asking a little girl, a sketchy man, or a whore, every character that is or not invited turns the world into something different. And this is one of the most engaging things to do. When there are dynamic interactions, the player starts to wonder what could have happened if they had done something different. Yes, pulling these kinds of quests can be tricky, but the minimum would be to make an interesting twist, so the player starts to wonder what's going on. At the end, the element of surprise has to be present. For example, in Trails Through Daybreak, there was this quest where a girl wanted to find something in the sewers, and while at first it felt like something trivial, once you accomplished the objective, it was like, ooh! These kinds of events expand the general vision of the world, leaving an interesting piece of memory. On this side, some Western RPGs shine a lot, and sometimes asking you to choose between something bad or something bad, but with real impact in the world. On the other hand, throwing NPCs for the sake of filling the world ends up leaving a bad taste, which was the case in Code Vein games. While there are several interactions with some random NPCs, assisting with finding their weapons, recovering the city, cleaning the water, and stuff like that, ultimately there were no impactful moments. The general tone at the end was quite low. Unfortunately, gathering items can be the most annoying kind of quest, because it is something simple that doesn't need something extra, or at least that is the way in which it is perceived. Of course, the best cases that came to my mind are the ones like in Xenoblade Chronicles, where sometimes special enemies may appear. This can also be perceived as something cheap, because of differences in levels, but at least it is more interesting than a classic simple gathering quest. Being honest, as part of a small tutorial, you can get away with this. But further down the line, I would argue that they need to have something extra to spice the experience. Once again, using the surprise elements. And of course, you cannot ask the player to gather 500 nudes scattered through the world, unless it was done as a kind of meme. Is it necessary for a quest to be announced as such, or is it better if the player finds it by exploring? Every time I think in subquest, this image of going into the tavern, a kind of board, random NPCs with icons on top, come to my mind. But is it really necessary to do that? For example, in Chrono Trigger, it is not like you see a screen announcing that you found a quest. And one that I love so much was something for like a song on, I don't remember the exact name. The deal is that you needed to beat a specific enemy at some point in time. Later you end up leaving the item in a specific cave, and most likely, in an ingenious move, you will travel to the future, but it disappears, adding substance to the journey. Not sure if that was the same one where you need to leave Robo in the past to reforest an area. Well, the question is, would this moment have had the same impact if it had been shown as just another subquest? I believe there is a predisposition of getting bored if you see the image of subquest or something like that popping up in the screen, but that may be different from person to person. Another similar case I love was Witch Spring Heart, where you need to beat a specific ice enemy to later take out a sword from a fire enemy. And finding these kinds of things on your own leaves a better sense of reward than just saying that you initiated a quest. The same idea would go for a game like After Image. You find NPCs, you talk to them, you trigger things in the world, and in that same way, you end up finding quest items as you move around. Or at least that is what happened to me with Nicole's quest. If it could be thrown into this same list, Symphony of the Night has plenty of interesting details like that. Something really important to consider is loot, rewards. Unless the game exploits a general lack of money wherever you go, oftentimes gathering or doing certain activities feels like a waste of time. Like, why would I want to waste my time if it isn't that big of a deal to make money? On that front, either you create a setting where every penny is like actual HP to survive, or you encourage the player with interesting rewards. Some parts in Xenoblade came to my mind. For example, when you unlock Poppy Cutie Pie, by the moment you get access to this quest, you can keep moving forward and simply look away. Or there is a promise. Perhaps the route to reach this point isn't the most entertaining one, having to gather specific things, but once you have completed the whole quest, you find that she can be quite broken because of her options. Yes, I won't deny that the minigame to get points kinda kills the mood, but at least you get a really solid character, even if you don't upgrade her up to that point. In a certain way, this reminds me to Horizon Zero Dawn and the armor that has something like a shield. The first time you find one of those little batteries, it was like, okay, this may be important. Later, if I remember well, you find the bunker, where you need to place those batteries, so it turns into a cool little reward. So it is important to keep this task within certain limits, and interesting points in the story, otherwise you may pull the most broken weapon, just to find that there is nothing else to do with it. It also kills the purpose, so timing and the weight of such reward is important. Do not reward something that is going to be thrown away in few hours, and do not leave the very best to the end. Nonetheless, if you want the player to find things for the sake of finding them, Code Vein 2 had an interesting approach in one quest, where you gather rocks, but the world is filled with these items. In other words, they weren't counted, turning this quest into something that you can do as you advance. Some games work in a quest-driven way, asking you to do things before you have the chance to proceed in the story. And to be honest, these kinds of entries can feel like hit or miss at some points. Because if you are asking to get something with really low chances to drop, most likely the player is going to throw the game out of the window. This was the case of Class of Heroes 1 or Operation Abyss. There are moments where you start to wonder, what the heck is going on? Where can you find those items? Sometimes there are tricks like selling those things in other shops scattered around, but I will argue once again with what kind of setting are you trying to make? Because if you dilute the experience, turning the game into a mindless pointer, then it is not going to work. But if you also make it misleading, things can become tedious and boring relatively quick. So here it is going to depend from the target audience. Cause yes, it is also fair to say that you shouldn't try to be the last bottle of water in the desert. Direction is something important to keep in mind. Always give the player a small lead, at least in those cases where it is required. There is nothing worse than be treated like a dum-dum with yellow paint, or as a DM, telling the players how to solve puzzles. Throwing a quest for the sake of doing it could also be perceived as filler. In some cases, Eterna Odyssey quest can be like, hey, I need you to gather an X number of these items. So you go back and forth beating the same enemy over and over and over again. So later they can throw you a couple of coins. In these cases you end up doing some of them, otherwise you cannot continue certain chains of quests that lead to the real content. Or, in other cases, because that way you increase a decent amount of experience. But ultimately, it cannot be denied that some of those quests are kinda lifeless. And to not overly extend the bit, as last point I will say, the most important is to have a meaningful experience. Just because you can fill a map doesn't mean you should. You want to give the player quality content. So throw something diverse here and there, even those questionable escort quests. I haven't played it, but in Cyberpunk, as far as I know, there is a mod to remove filler quests, and the fact that plenty of people have downloaded says a lot. In any case, regarding the escort quest, I tried to think in a good example of them, but I didn't remember any in the 10-minute mark. I mean, I remember the negative ones, like Fire Emblem, where things go sour, some Diablo, where you move around in a desert like a dumb arse guard, in some Ys games where you travel with a girl here and there, Death and Request Odyssey with the heroines. I don't know, maybe try to make a good escort quest. In summary, it is important to make the world feel alive, with surprise elements, where simple fetch or gather quests turned into memorable experiences, where at the end the player gets to enjoy a cool item or something to enrich the journey, while of course keeping all of these secondary quests within certain limits, because you don't want to mislead the player and, most importantly, bloat your game with mindless, repetitive tasks. Or at least, that is my opinion. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.